Welcome, my name is Andrea Willis. I'm from the Behavioural Economics team of the Australian Government, or BETA, and I'm thrilled to be here today to facilitate this session focusing on diversity and inclusion and how BI can help. So improving the diversity and inclusiveness of our organisations is a pretty current and topical issue. We see this topic discussed regularly at the boardroom and at the CEO and secretary level, all the way through operationally, through all of the operational areas of our organisations on pretty much a daily basis. It's also a pretty regular topic in the media too. Now, behavioural insights is not necessarily a new thing in this space, but there is a growing body of evidence supporting different areas where we can intervene and using what we know about human biases to improve the way that we attract, retain, recruit, and manage talent in our organisations. Having a diverse and inclusive workforce is a key goal for lots of organisations these days, and many of them are incredibly vocal about it. Today, we will explore what some of the current challenges are in achieving this and how behavioural insights can help. Today, we've got a fabulous panel of experts with us who all have experience in researching, understanding, and overcoming some of the issues and challenges in creating truly inclusive and diverse organisations and communities. Later on, we'll be joined by Kate Glazebrook, who's the CEO and co-founder of Applied. Sorry, my notes just went to sleep. Karen Gonsalkorale, who is an experimental and social psychologist here at the University of Sydney. Mike Luca, an associate professor from Harvard Business School. But to start off today, I'm really pleased to introduce our current Race Discrimination Commissioner, Tim Soutphommasane. We're really lucky to have Tim here today, especially as he's nearing the end of his term in this exciting position. There'll be lots of opportunities for the audience to ask questions today. It's a pretty small group, so I'd encourage you to ask all of those burning questions you've got sitting within you. So let's get started. Can everyone please join me in welcoming Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Tim Soutphommasane, to the stage.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, good morning, everyone. Wonderful to be joining you, and I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Today, I'd like to challenge you about the defaults that we have on cultural diversity and on diversity in general, because when we speak about diversity or inclusion, I dare say many of us are thinking of gender diversity, or at least a leaning towards that dimension of diversity. And today I want to say a little about how important it is that we give air and time to cultural diversity in its own right as a concern. Very often I hear when I speak to leaders about the need for doing more on diversity and inclusion, that it's too hard to tackle cultural diversity specifically. I'll hear people say, we currently are devoted to diversity and inclusion in our organisation. We want to ensure that everyone can bring their authentic self to work. We've set targets, in fact, on ensuring that a certain proportion of our leadership are women. But we want to make sure that we do this right. We want to tread carefully. We've got a plan. It's a 3-year plan. Maybe it's a 4-year plan. And the suggestion is, once we solve gender, then we can start talking about culture, let alone other dimensions of diversity, of course. Now, I think that's a recipe for deflection and failure. That's a cop-out. If you want to do diversity right, you've got to do all dimensions of diversity at the same time. And this is true not only for cultural diversity, it's true as well for how we deal with disability or how we deal with LGBTI issues. Now, we've got to be more courageous and more bold in how we deal with diversity and inclusion. The second diff I would like to challenge today is around our narrative or story about who we are as a country. If we were to think about diversity and multiculturalism today, we can lapse into the usual story about how we're the most successful multicultural society in the world. And don't get me wrong, I think we are one of the great multicultural success stories in the world. But if that's where the conversation begins and ends, we don't need to do anything, do we? There's not much more that needs to be done. It's almost a case of mission accomplished. So what I want to do today is take you through some of the research we've done on cultural diversity in Australia, which I believe challenges us to look into the mirror, challenges us to ask ourselves whether we are making the most of our multicultural talents and whether we are living up to our status as one of the most successful multicultural societies in the world. The research that I'm referring to has been done in partnership with a number of organisations, the Australian Human Rights Commission obviously, but also the University of Sydney Business School, Asia Society Australia and the Committee for Sydney. Some of you may be familiar with an earlier iteration of the research that we did in 2016. What we did was we tried to provide then a snapshot of Australia's senior leaders based on their cultural composition. This year we looked at 2,500 senior leaders in business, in politics, in government and in higher education. To be very specific, the ASX 200 CEOs and group executives. We looked at the federal parliament, including the federal ministry. We looked at the heads of federal and state government departments, so secretaries and directors general and deputy secretaries and deputy directors general or equivalent. Also the vice chancellors and deputy vice chancellors of our 39 universities. But before we get to that, I just want to throw up an image of bear with me, folks. Here's what the Australian population looks like in its cultural composition. Now, it's difficult to say authoritatively what our ethnic and cultural composition looks like in Australia. You might be surprised by that, but it's because the Australian Bureau of Statistics does not collect comprehensive or dedicated data on our ethnic and cultural diversity. We've got data on self-identified ancestry, on places of birth, languages spoken at home, but nothing like the New Zealanders, for example, have on their ethnic composition. The New Zealanders would be able to tell you down to a few decimal points what percentage of their population has a European ethnic background, or what percentage has a Maori ethnic background, or an Asian ethnic background. We can't do that in Australia. What we did do, however, was we looked at the 2016 census results on ancestry and we modelled for what our ethnic and cultural composition might look like. We did this with some assistance from an employee resource group from the Reserve Bank, interested in data and cultural diversity. But we estimate that about 58% of the Australian population has an Anglo-Celtic background. That's British or Irish, going back 2 generations. We estimate as well that about 21% have a non-European cultural background, encompassing Asian, Middle Eastern, North African, African, South American and Pacific backgrounds. We estimate that 18 have a European, non-Anglo-Celtic background, so anything continental Europe, and 3% have an Indigenous background. Again, it's an estimate, but I believe it's something that gives us a more useful picture of what our diversity looks like, rather than me just saying to you that 28% of people were born overseas and another 20% of people have a parent who was born overseas. Now that's a very accurate statistic, but what it says about our diversity is perhaps more limited than what we need to realise. Here's what our CEOs look like. So of the 370 odd CEOs that we identified in this study, 11 have a non-European or Indigenous background. Now, that's just enough to constitute a cricket team. If you were to look at particular sectors, in, say the ASX 200 group of CEOs, you've got enough to fit into a Tarago. Could be a good carpool. But if you compare that with the Australian population in general, you're talking about a quarter of the population, or close to it, that has a non-European or Indigenous background. You see here that it's barely reflected among CEOs. Now, we looked at the second tier of leadership as well, and that number rises from about 3% to 5%. So to those who might be thinking, well, this is a product of time, you might not be seeing diversity in the mix of our CEOs at the moment, but they're coming through the ranks. I can tell you, they're not there. The pipeline isn't there, because we know that the next lot of CEOs are going to come from that second tier of leadership, so we're not going to see any significant change for the next 5 or 10 years, other things being equal. That's what we firmly believe, and I'm pretty confident in saying that. Now, why does this matter? Well, obviously, we know that there is a strong business case for why diversity matters. This is the research done by McKinsey, which I'll gather many of you are already familiar with, done with respect to about 360 companies internationally, done twice, in fact, in 2014 and 17, but with very similar findings, correlations at least. A strong correlation between having more between having gender diversity and ethnic diversity and improved performance measured by profitability. You see on screen there that the top quartile of companies according to gender diversity are 21% more likely to outperform the median on profitability. When it comes to ethnic diversity, the top quartile is 33% more likely. So the payoff for ethnic diversity is significant, larger perhaps than what you see for gender diversity. But there's also a more basic reason as to why we should be worrying about diversity and its representation. Here's a snapshot of some of the leaders that we looked at. Obviously, you've got to zoom in to see all the faces, but you can't bear what you can't see. We hear that very often, particularly around gender diversity and the need for more women in leadership positions. The same issue exists for cultural diversity. If people from ethnic minority and cultural minority backgrounds do not see people like them in positions of leadership, don't underestimate the power that can have in how they form their expectations and define their ambitions. Now, there's no issue with the representation of cultural diversity if you look at our top achieving students in high schools or universities. But something's happening. There are blockages that are clearly there, whether they emerge 5 years after people enter the workforce or 7 or 10, and it's not clear where all of this talent is going. Some of it could be going overseas, and we hear anecdotal stories from people who believe that their best prospects of success are perhaps in Shanghai and not in Sydney, or perhaps in Mumbai and not in Melbourne. And you can make an argument to say, well, talent might go overseas, but talent might come back in a few years' time. But I believe the risk of losing that talent is greater than the prospect of getting them back. Could be, in 20 or 30 years if you're serious about waiting to get that talent back. What needs to happen? Well, I think there needs to be a conversation around a number of things, one of which is data and the need to get serious about targets on cultural diversity. I've just put the logos of a few organisations up there. These are some of the organisations, and there aren't very many, who have explicitly adopted targets for ethnic and cultural diversity in Australia. To the best of my knowledge, they are the 4 that I'm aware of that have in place targets on cultural diversity for leadership positions. CBA has this. PwC has had a target for culturally diverse backgrounds in their partner admissions for the last few years. Earlier this year, EY announced that they were also going to be introducing targets for partners and also those at a manager level in their organisation. The ABC similarly has targets for cultural diversity. but I can't think of many other organisations that have done this. Compare this situation to the number of organisations that have adopted targets for gender equality, and you get a sense of what I'm talking about when I say that the default on diversity is really gender, and people aren't prepared to entertain the idea of having cultural targets in the way that they're prepared to have gender targets. Also, there needs to be work around professional development. Many of you would be aware of what happened in the United States with Starbucks, which closed a few thousand of its stores for an entire day so that the whole workforce in that company was given anti-racism and diversity training. Now again, there's a default that we have here around training and professional development on these issues, which I believe needs to be tackled. No one dares to mention the word race or anti-racism training. We are much more likely to talk about diversity training or training about unconscious bias. Don't get me wrong, I think unconscious bias exists. It exists in many forms. I, for example, experience it myself personally when I talk about my work, and quite often when I say that I work at the Human Rights Commission, people will ask me, do you work in the finance or the IT section of the Human Rights Commission? No malice in it, but perhaps a window into what people might believe a person who looks like me is likely to do for work. We need to get more explicit about these issues, and sometimes what we label as unconscious bias is very conscious bias. And what we might refer to just as bias is really discrimination. If bias is reflected in action or given action, that is discrimination. It's not just bias. Quite often we like to think of this as just people having certain thoughts which they can't control, which are part of our human impulses, part of the necessity that we have in our brains to categorize and make sense of information in a complex world. That's true. But if you act on it and people are disadvantaged by it, or some get a benefit from it, then that's discrimination, and we should be prepared to call it out. So, how do we deal with this? Who can see what's written on that screen? Are there some who don't see what's written on that screen? This is actually drawn from a colour blindness test that is frequently used for sight. Now, we've been deliberate in throwing the word race in there because quite often I hear from people about these issues that they don't see race. I just don't see colour. I don't know, I know that racism exists, but it doesn't affect me because some of my best friends are from different backgrounds and I see them for the people they are. I don't see their differences. This is one default that we have to get over. Do you see a Swedish-looking man talking to you? Do you see an African background man talking to you? Do you see someone with no cultural or racial characteristics at all? Of course not. It's one thing for us to see colour and difference. It is, of course, another thing to act on it or to believe that there's moral power or standing bound up in those differences. And yet we don't even get past that first step of acknowledging that there are differences and you see them. Children see them. I think the most revealing part of how we deal with our differences and colour in particular is how we talk to children about race and difference. If you are from an ethnic or racial minority background, you can bet that you'll be talking to your children about race and colour and difference. If you're from a majority background, you may not, for obvious reasons. But I think of that scenario where you might be standing in the checkout counter at the shops and you might have a 5 or 6 year old child, as they do, saying very loudly about the man in front of you, "Look, Mum, that man has X or Y coloured skin." And you think about the response to that. I would say that there'd be many people who would be deeply uncomfortable about what the child would have said and would most likely be telling the child not to say anything. Rather, than simply explaining to the child, yes, people have different colour skins because people come from different places. That man and his family might come from one place and we come from another place. Something like that. But I think of how often it is, particularly with primary school age children in Australia, when there are discussions in classrooms about culture and race, how striking it is that among Anglo-Celtic background children in particular, the response might be in the form of, I'm just normal, or I don't have a culture, whereas you don't get that with children from other cultures. That's a window into the defaults that families have in talking about differences. This matters because if you aren't aware of differences, you could, in all sincerity, say that you don't believe racism is a problem. And we see this in our public discourse. Just in the last few weeks, we have heard from some parliamentarians, for example, who say that racism is very rare and isolated. Just because you don't experience it yourself doesn't mean that other people don't experience it. This is what the evidence tells us, that about 1/5 of Australians have experienced racial or religious discrimination in the past 12 months. But again, the default here is denial and deflection that racism exists or warrants consideration. There's a default that we need to challenge as well, which is around what leadership currently looks like and what merit in leadership must involve. Now, I've chosen this picture only because it is fairly current being the operative phrase. Very often when we talk about cultural diversity and the need for things like targets, we hear the inevitable retort, well, we need to have merit. We want to make appointments based on merit. We shouldn't have a box-ticking exercise where we only appoint people because of their background. Now, I'm a believer in merit. The ideal of meritocracy makes sense to me, but it only makes sense if there is a level playing field. And if we're completely honest and open about how we make decisions in appointing leaders, let's acknowledge that there are already effective quotas in place in all sorts of contexts about how people get to the top. I mean, if you're in a public listed company and you're looking at the board composition, it's very often the case that the board composition will reflect the ownership structure or the shareholding of the company. That's not about merit, but we don't seem to have alarm about how merit doesn't apply to the appointment of board directors in publicly listed companies. When we have political parties in coalition in government, seats around the cabinet table can be allocated based on party affiliation alone. We don't object to that for an appointment that's not based on merit. So if we're not objecting that, why are we objecting then to any notion of having targets or even quotas in place for cultural diversity? Let me conclude with this. We can talk about nudges. I've talked a lot about defaults already. But sometimes nudging people gently may not be enough. Sometimes you need to do something more. Sometimes the default needs to be set through law, through legislation. And I'll bring you back to the comparison I made between gender equality and cultural diversity. In recent years, we have made good progress on gender equality. Not enough, but some progress. And a lot of that has to do with the structures we have in place in collecting data about gender diversity. Currently, we don't collect any comprehensive data on ethnic or cultural diversity. But if we are serious about getting the most of our multicultural talents, I believe we need to be serious about considering having a legislative mandate for organisations in Australia to collect data on ethnic and cultural diversity. There will be scepticism and resistance, but I believe it is anomalous for one of the world's most successful multicultural societies not to have such data when other like countries whether it's the United States or Britain or Canada or New Zealand, can have access to such data in ready order and quantity. Thanks. Where do you want me? Okay.
Hello. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful. Now, I'd like to give the audience the chance now to ask Tim some questions. But before we do, there's someone very important I didn't introduce to you at the beginning of the session. Right at the back there, we have the wonderful Simon Banks, who's a graphic artist. And he's capturing the session today in illustrated form. And after the session, his illustration of the key points of our discussion will be captured, and you'll be able to download those from the BX website. And you'll see him popping up at a couple of other sessions over the next hour or two as well. Okay. Now today, to gather your audience questions, we're going to be using a catch box. Now, I know you're all very skeptical and you're probably thinking, is this like a BI trick? It's not. It's just something fun that we thought we'd like to use throughout the conference. So it works just like a regular mic, but the idea is that you can throw it or toss it or gently pass it around the room to your fellow participants. And then can you give us a demo of how it works, please?
Who would want to catch the person?
Okay, and do you have a question?
I do, yes.
Wonderful. Now, please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and fire away.
My name's David Tunnicliffe. I have a consultancy which addresses age-related issues called Grey Matters. I was wondering, I have a natural resistance to the idea of mandatory, of introducing yet more laws. It strikes me that one of the things that we need less of is legal frameworks and more in terms of self-regulated behaviour, because we perceive that to be in our own interests. I was wondering to what extent you felt that there was more opportunity to dial up the benefits of diversity in the workplace in such a way that it's made real for companies that employ, as opposed to concentrate on the you should and thou shalt not approach, which is implicit in the legislative approach.
Well, we can talk about the benefits all we want, and that's what we've been doing for years, but we have not seen anything move. Now, to crystallise the issue here, when we talk about cultural diversity and what we do in workplaces, quite often people will say, we value cultural diversity, and that's why every year on March the 21st we have a Harmony Day lunch, and we invite our staff to bring foods for a potluck lunch, maybe even wear something ancestral so they can identify, express who they are at work, and through that we will have conversations where people can appreciate people's differences. Now, look, I hear some giggles in the audience, and you know why? It's because a lot of that effort is tokenistic. So I think those efforts you're referring to in appealing to the better angels of people's nature, talking up the benefits of diversity, yes, it can get people there, and I believe there's a place for it, but we can't think of this as being about either or. So for me, it's not about either talking only about the positives or dealing with things through legislative mandates. And for me, the legislative mandate I'm referring to is really about data collection. I don't think we should be horrendously threatened by data collection as if that were an act of imposition from the state about how you've got to do this or you've got to do that. We already collect data of various kinds. We just don't collect it on cultural diversity. And I don't think we can measure how we're performing on this issue if we don't, measure it. We just don't know. And there are too many unknowns here that are convenient. When I say convenient, I'll give you an example of what I mean. People say, well, it is one thing to collect data on gender because that is relatively straightforward. But how do we go about collecting data on ethnicity or culture? What is cultural background? How are you going to define it? Obviously, it is a lot more complex. But does that mean that the task is completely beyond us? I don't think so, but it does challenge how we currently think about cultural diversity and background. So for me, I think we've given it enough time to have voluntary action and to let the benefits of diversity speak for themselves. I think it's time now to shake it up a little and challenge people and change the default so that we can see some more material change. I don't for a moment deny the need to talk about the benefits, and you will have seen that I've made the argument for why getting diversity right is important in material terms as well as about a moral argument. But when things don't change and when things don't happen, I think that's when you've got to start changing your approach as well.
Sure.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that the argument hadn't been made. I just feel that the argument could be better made. And given that most commercial organizations anyway seek to optimize and work in their own self-interest, if they perceive something to be in their self-interest, they're likely to change because the benefits are concrete. And I'm just thinking that possibly, often people, when they say something has been tried, neglect the fact that the process through that trial wasn't optimal. I've encountered that a great deal in my consultancy life where people said, we've tried this and we've tried that, and you look at what they actually did and you realize it's filled with flaws and no wonder it didn't work. So really all I'm suggesting is maybe there's scope to reframe that advantage.
And I would add to that, and I'm not in fundamental disagreement with you, it's just about some of the nuances. When I do see organizations taking action on an issue like this, it is striking how personal the mission can be for the leaders involved. They've got skin in the game. And that to me is perhaps the missing link here. I think you've got to define the benefits, but you've also got to talk about things in a way which appeals to people's personal commitment as well.
Great, thank you. Oh.
Hi, my name's Nadia Chaves. I'm actually a specialist physician at a Melbourne public hospital, and I'm also doing a PhD in behaviour change with Behaviour Works. Thank you so much for bringing out what is just not talked about at all. In my own hospital, I tried to launch a Racism It Stops With Me campaign, and I was told that's a great idea, and then it went to diversity is a really nice issue to talk about. There's not enough people talking about this issue, and I'm not sure why. I've actually had a really privileged background. I speak English, and I've always been pretty well off, but it's my patients that suffer across the health system. And we're not lawyers, so I want to know, do you have any ideas about nudges in this area for people who can't? We can write petitions and we can vote differently, but what about people working in the system? What are your ideas about nudges in this area?
It's about being more comfortable about discomfort. So it's that paradox. I mean, one reason I think a lot of efforts to deal with racism are deflected and turned into feel-good cultural diversity exercises is people are deeply uncomfortable about talking about race, and they're uncomfortable because they believe it might imply some admission of guilt or wrongdoing. I think if you're able to get people beyond that almost reflex form of resistance, then you've got a chance to have the conversation. And I always say, well, if you're feeling uncomfortable about just talking about racism or bias, imagine what it's like experiencing it or being on the receiving end of it. The discomfort of just talking about it is a fairly low cost of admission. And if anything, we should all be open to feeling a bit uncomfortable about this, because we're not going to truly understand these issues until we're able to walk in other people's shoes. Now, how you do that, I think, depends on where you're starting from and the different contexts you're in. You might have an organisation where you get permission from leadership to have that conversation, in which case I think you can be very direct. If you're not at that point yet, then think of some way to introduce people's human experience into the conversation to start it, because we can argue about the analytical side of things, but you can't dispute people's lived reality and experience. But even that is harder to do than what it sounds, because you can have people talking about their lived experience and then have others say, well, you know, that's just not true. It doesn't happen to me. We get this quite often when we talk about these issues with different audiences. People will say, you know, in all of my life, I've never seen this happen. Therefore, it just doesn't happen. I've never seen an armed robbery, but I know they happen. I didn't see a car accident happening this morning on my way here, but I can tell you there would have been a few car accidents occurring this morning in Sydney. Just because you don't see it yourself doesn't mean that it doesn't therefore exist or occur. But that for me is just the most basic attitudinal, maybe it's behavioural to some extent, barrier that I see in the conversations about race. And if we want to dig into why that's the case, I think it's because a lot of people are taught not to talk about race. Race is something taboo, and it implies an admission of guilt. So, you know, just to quickly add just one more point, when I talk, for example, about the composition of our population or the overrepresentation of certain backgrounds in leadership, you should not be taking from that I've got a personal hostility towards people of that background. This is a structural observation. This is not something that's aimed at particular people, but quite often that's how it can be construed if people are defensive or uncomfortable.
Thank you. We might take one more question from the audience before we invite the panel up on stage.
So my name's Annie Trong. I'm from the Victorian Behavioural Insights Unit. Fascinating discussion. And in terms of, I guess, your approach around legislating for change, I guess my question kind of goes to your point around, and much earlier on in your discussion around targets and this idea of meritocracy. And if we were to go down that path of talking about targets and quotas and affirmative action and things like that, I wonder what your thoughts are and what your views are on the potential backlash once something like that is implemented, particularly something along the lines of, oh, the only reason he or she got that job is because there's a target and a quota. Yep.
How do we define merit at the moment? You know, I think that's got to be part of the conversation, and we've got to be prepared to highlight that merit is something that is subjective. And it becomes more subjective the higher you get up in an organisation. Now we can disagree about that, but you know, there's when you look at some of the literature that's been done on this by academic scholars, I think we're on solid ground in saying that, and the sorts of traits or qualities that we might associate with leadership in a given context is quite often something that's defined culturally. We often will hear about cultural fit, for example, in discussions about leadership and suitability. If we're talking about defaults, quite often the default that is attached to some minority groups is to say, well, that person needs a bit more time, they're not quite ready for that yet. Whereas a default for someone else who may feel more familiar might be, you know what, I think we should take a punt on that person. I back that person. That's how ideas about merit and talent play out. In terms of a backlash, there may well be some resistance to this, but you've got to be ready to tackle it, and you've got to have leadership commitment behind it if you are going to adopt targets. But I think if you have such a disproportionate underrepresentation of certain backgrounds when the pool of talent, particularly at the point of entry, is so hyper-diverse, I think you've got a very obvious issue there in how you're managing your talent. So for me, a target is about ensuring that you have a more level playing field from a structural perspective. And it should not be there as a permanent fixture. It should be there as a remedial response to ensure that your organisation or industry can reset. But the challenge that I've put to you on legislative dimensions of this is one that I think is something we need to talk about now, because very often we can talk about doing this softly, but let's be bloody direct about this. I don't look at Australian society and think that we see a very natural distribution of talent represented in our organisations at the moment, because I see what the talent looks like coming through, and it has been that way for 10, 15, 20 years at least now, and it hasn't made a dent in what our organisations currently look like. And if we are such a successful multicultural society, we should be asking ourselves whether this is how it should be playing out.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We might welcome our panellists on stage now. Kate, Karen and Mike, welcome to the discussion. I'm sure there's lots we've talked about, or Tim has talked about, that you're keen to comment on. So I'll just give all of our panellists a chance now to introduce themselves, to tell you a little bit more about who they are and what they do and why we've asked them to join us in this discussion today. Kate, can I start with you, please?
Sure. Well, fantastic discussion so far. So hi, everyone. I'm Kate Glazebrook. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of an organisation called Applied. We're the first technology spin-out of the Behavioural Insights team. And we use behavioural science and data science to try and improve hiring decisions. Our sort of 3 North Stars are: we want to make hiring decisions smarter, so more predictive of finding the best people for the job. We want to make them fairer by removing any areas of unconscious bias, but also noise and error in the way that we make decisions about who we work with. And we want to try and make all of that, if it's possible, feel as easy as possible. So think of us as basically an applicant system. People apply through our platform and we reshape the information that people see when they're deciding who they want to hire. So we remove things that we consider might be distractions, and we try and foreground the things that actually measure better talent. And we've now had about 45,000 candidates apply through our platform for different jobs all over the world, and happy to tell you a little bit about that, and really thrilled to be talking about some of these issues. They're thorny, they're hard, but they're absolutely the most important ones, including the difficult question around what is merit. So pleased to be here.
Thanks, Kate. Karen, over to you.
My name is Karen Gonsalkorale and I'm at the University of Sydney. I'm an experimental social psychologist, and I study things like prejudice and stereotyping and identity, and in some ways it's not at all surprising that I landed up studying these topics. I'm originally from Hong Kong, arrived here as a baby. My mother, we were raised by a single mother, and she didn't speak any English. I remember growing up and not wanting to be different. And so it's really not surprising that I've ended up here. So a lot of the work that I do, I think, really shows how thorny and sticky some of these questions are. And what I'm really passionate about is distilling these complexities and taking it out to the field and actually making a difference within organisations so that we can be more inclusive of all the types of groups that we have in our society.
Thank you. And Mike?
I'm Michael Luca. I'm a faculty member at Harvard Business School. So for the last few years, I spent a lot of time studying discrimination in online marketplaces, thinking about places like Airbnb and the role that race plays in admissions decisions. More recently, I've been doing some work in the tech sector, thinking about the hiring process and how you could use behavioral economics to help de-bias the hiring process.
Great, thank you. So I have a lot of questions, but I'd really love to give everyone else in the room a chance to ask theirs. So I might start off with 1 or 2 and then we'll tip over to the audience. But if you've got a question at any point, please make yourself known to Anne Lynn or whoever has the catch box, because I'd want to hear your thoughts as much as I want to get the answers to the questions that I've thought about a lot. So my first question to the panel is, I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the things that Tim's talked about today and some of the questions we've already had from the audience, and where you think in that context are the richest areas for BI to intervene. Mike, do you want to kick us off? You look ready to go there with that mic.
So I thought that there was a lot that was really fascinating in what Tim was saying. I guess I would just kind of mention one anecdote from the U.S., from the tech sector, that kind of reminds me a lot of what you were talking about. In 2013, there was kind of this wake-up moment in the tech sector in the U.S. where people realized that there was a real lack of diversity. And part of what had happened is an engineer named Tracy Chu, who was working at Pinterest at the time, uploaded a spreadsheet and started asking people to just kind of say how diverse their companies were, and the engineering teams in particular. The next year, a few companies, kind of Google, Yelp, Twitter, and some others, started revealing their diversity numbers, which of course were kind of grim at the time. I think this is no secret now, kind of, low double digits, 10%, 14%. Bunches of companies had fewer than 20% of engineering roles filled by women. Racial diversity was also an issue, kind of more in, especially in sales roles, but also in engineering roles too. But kind of just having transparency over the last few years has led to some progress. So kind of when we ask questions like, can a nudge for having transparency around diversity numbers, can that work? I think kind of there's good precedent to understand that this could have a large impact. So if you look at Yelp, for instance, they've gone from 10% female engineers to 18% female engineers. They do have kind of implicit targets that they kind of at least have, or internally kind of thinking about how diverse they want to be in a particular area. So I think kind of companies are thinking about how to think about targets. And I think that is a great conversation to have, both kind of on the ethnic composition front and on the gender front.
Great, thank you. Karen, your thoughts?
So I'm very interested in this question of meritocracy, which has been raised a number of times, and I think there are big issues, bigger questions that we can think about to do with it, have those difficult conversations. But I think there's some really interesting research coming out of experimental social psychology research, which actually looks at quite potentially simplistic ways that we can actually talk about these things in mission statements and in job ads and things like that. And typically it's been a case of sort of saying, well, do we emphasise multiculturalism, which typically appeals to ethnic minority, or do we emphasise meritocracy, which typically, very generalising here, but typically appeals to ethnic majorities. And so there's actually been research which shows that you could actually do a hybrid approach, and just by changing a few different words on a mission statement. So for example, instead of just talking about how we value difference, we value different cultures, if you talk about valuing those differences, but also ensuring that we do indeed pick the best people for the job, this could actually appeal to a wider base. And so people from all different backgrounds seem to find that these hybrid approaches to be actually more inclusive, and they feel less threatened overall. So that's a potential nudge that perhaps could be worth looking at.
Thanks. Kate?
The two things that really struck me, one was I was nodding very kind of agitatedly when you were saying that everyone sort of talks about, okay, we're talking about diversity and we're starting with gender. I mean, given that we work in talking with a lot of HR teams about what diversity means to them and their organisations, they say, okay, let me tell you what I'm doing on gender, and we think we'll next tackle, and it's often race and ethnicity, though interestingly, increasingly social mobility and socioeconomic status, and it's interesting, I think, how our perceptions in organisations of what the priorities are on diversity are shifting themselves. But I agree with you. You said, we cannot tackle diversity earnestly unless we're tackling all of them at the same time. And as a platform that collects data, or as candidates come in, we collect data on 6 different dimensions of diversity. Insufficient always, but we're hoping to try and increase the amount of information just used to answer the very questions you were talking about. And I guess on the meritocracy question, so as a hiring platform, we help to not only remove information, so when you're assessing candidates, you don't see name, for example, you don't see cultural background. We try and remove things we think could be distractions to identifying true talent. But equally, that then puts the onus on how are you testing candidates for the job? Because that then comes back to a question of what do we understand success to look like in our organisation? And I think that's the beginnings of a conversation that at least helps us to answer, well, are we defining what leadership looks like by what we often do when we take a job description is we say, well, Mike did this job last and he was great, so I'm going to kind of describe Mike in the job description. To actually, what are the tasks involved in that particular job? What does success look like by the things he needs to do in a given week? And sometimes even that subtle shift from thinking about a person to thinking about the tasks helps to move the needle not only toward more predictably finding someone who's going to be good at it, but also hopefully disentangling these sort of difficult notions of what the culture of the person is to the kind of job at hand. I'm not saying we've solved for it, but we're helping to collect data and better understand those questions.
Great, thank you. Now, I personally feel that any panel discussion on diversity is incomplete without a discussion on unconscious bias training. So I might ask that question. So really keen to hear from our panel around, there's lots of chatter in the media, we're starting to gather more evidence around what works in this space. Does unconscious bias training add value? What are its shortcomings? Is it something we should be encouraging our organisations do? Kate, I know you have views.
So I follow the research of people in this room and elsewhere on this, which seems to suggest that unfortunately the relationship between doing 2 hours or even a day's worth of training and actual changes in behaviour and how we hire and understand talent and promote and so forth is pretty weak. And actually, from a neurological standpoint, we shouldn't be hugely surprised by that. Like, the point of unconscious bias is, one, it's unconscious, and two, it's usually created and reinforced, and Karen, you can speak much more authoritatively than I can on this, but created and reinforced by our lived experience in a world which contains bias and discrimination and racism, to use all of the words. So, you can't retrain the brain that quickly, so we shouldn't be assuming that unconscious bias training in and of itself will solve the problem. I think there is some value in it because there is some evidence to suggest that it helps to increase awareness of the problem and helps to build some empathy, particularly if they're done well, particularly if they contain perspective-taking exercises, and there is a spectrum of more evidence-based versions. But I think to expect that we can say, oh my God, we've got a problem, Starbucks style, let's take everyone out of the stores and put them through a day's worth of training, tick box, it's done. I mean, that's unrealistic and I think will only lead to disappointment.
Mm-hmm. Karen, what can you add?
Yes, I absolutely agree that it can potentially add value by increasing awareness, but really the point of it, in my mind, is to really make sure that people can actually transfer that to their everyday lives. And so if the message is you can't control this, you can't do anything about it, they're just going to walk away demoralised, not knowing what to do with it. And so I think, again, we could be using some behavioural insights to ensure that we can actually train people on how to then take it back to their workplace and not actually be biased in the way and not be discriminatory. And so we can do things like provide them with tools, checklists, provide them with implementation intentions, provide them with commitment devices to really increase the effectiveness of these programs. It's also really important to note that there's some research which suggests that the mere presence of having diversity and implicit and unconscious bias training can actually do more harm than good, in the sense that it can actually make people feel as though they are in a fair organisation, and then when discrimination claims come up, they don't actually see it as discriminatory, even if it is. And so it's all about making sure that it's not just a protection mechanism, but actually a catalyst for real change.
Great, thank you. Tim, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a lot of research done, particularly in North America, about the effectiveness of bias training. I would add a note of caution just to extrapolate those findings in America to the Australian setting. I don't think we can say with confidence that the finding in a North American setting translates directly to an Australian setting. That's one general caveat. Two, I wonder whether focusing more on behaviours as opposed to attitudes is a better way of approaching this, because we know that it is difficult to shift people's attitudes, but if we focus on just shifting people's behaviour, I mean, I believe there's a loop, right? Sure, attitudes can shape behaviour, but behaviours also reinforce attitudes or shape attitudes as well, and I think we're on stronger ground if we try and reshape how people treat each other as opposed to focusing on how people think about others. It's hard work to, as already been alluded to recircuit people's heads around human experience. But if you focus on discrete actions people should or should not be taking when they deal with other people, that gives us something very, very practical. The third point coming off that is I believe it's got to be experiential. Any training or any education we do on this can't just be cerebral in nature. It's got to get people to feel things. And I think of, this is old-fashioned, but I think of the experiments that people like Jane Elliott have done over the decades, highlights how visceral this needs to be before people genuinely understand what's at play. Now, do we get that through the unconscious bias training that we currently see many organisations adopt? I suspect not, because it's too scary and too risky and maybe too divisive for people. But if you're going to be serious about it, I think you've got to be able to understand what this humanly looks like. And you just don't understand an issue like this without getting a feeling in your gut.
Karen, you're involved in the Project Implicit. I'm assuming a lot of the audience are familiar with the IAT, but perhaps you could talk us through it quickly and the connections that might have to what Tim's just talked about.
Right, so Project Implicit is an educational tool where you go online and you can take a test which actually can help you to understand what sort of, I call them implicit, not unconscious biases that you might have. And so we have tests like looking at, who do we perceive as being the prototypical Australian? And we often find that even people who are egalitarian, who really espouse multiculturalism, their default for an Australian is someone who's white. And so this portal actually also collects a lot of data, and so this data has been used to be able to sort of predict, for example, regional differences in bias, and also try to understand how patterns of biases might also map onto cross-national indices, for example, in gender equality and things like that. And I think that it is very important for people to have that feeling. I think it actually gives people this feeling because it actually gives you some feedback as to what degree of bias you might show, and maybe you don't, but a lot of people are actually surprised by that. And I think that it's exactly the kind of visceral feeling that Tim is talking about.
Great, thank you. We might turn over to the audience now. I feel like I've hogged the mic for long enough. We've got someone with the mic.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth. I'm from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Innovation Exchange. We look at innovations in how Australia delivers its aid to developing countries. And so I've just got a question. So there's two parts to diversity. So with diversity, there's many different cultures involved, and some cultures are more articulative and more can be more bolder in the way that it expresses itself. Some cultures, and we see a lot of that with developing countries, where they're more hesitant and would need permission in a way to be able to, so they need empowering. So I was wondering if you've got any advice or any nudges that you would, you could impart about how to do things like that in places where it's not just about those that deliver it, but it's also about empowering the ones that are not able, that don't have voices, the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tim, would you like to start off responding to that?
I don't have as much experience in international context, but I believe what I've seen in a domestic context has some bearing on the issue that you've raised. In a meeting context, how you go about eliciting responses from your group is important. If you just say to people, okay, let's hear your thoughts, and just allow for the group to speak without any further prompting, what you're likely to get is you're going to get people who have the more assertive personalities speaking up. You might get a different response if you take the time to just go to each person in the group and ask for a dedicated response. And I would say that there'd be some cultural backgrounds or practices which would be consonant with a certain idea of authority or respect, where you consider it out of turn for you to put yourself forward unless you're superior or unless you're asked for your opinion. I mean, there can be something cultural in that, the idea that you shouldn't be showboating or you shouldn't be presuming to have expertise if you're not being invited to say something. So I think the very practical behavioural tweak you can make there is to ensure that if you're chairing a meeting, that you don't just leave it open and ask for thoughts, but you actually find a way to ensure that everyone has a turn so that people are prepared to participate in the way that they should, and in a way that can highlight the contributions that they can make.
Thank you. Mike?
So this is actually something that comes up a lot in the HBS classroom. So we have a very diverse classroom, people from all over the world. Now, one of the things we think about is kind of how do you facilitate a discussion with people who have different norms, like kind of different kind of procedures for when you should and shouldn't participate that they're bringing in with them. One thing that we try to think about in the classroom setting, I think probably generalized at least to some organizational context, is thinking about how do you kind of almost explicitly set norms as a group kind of in the beginning. How often should people be speaking in a meeting? Should you kind of, if you just said something, kind of take a time out and let somebody else kind of chime in with an answer? But also, one thing I've noticed that kind of never ceases to amaze me is the extent to which students take it upon themselves to kind of create like a team environment where if they see somebody who hasn't spoken for a couple of days, they'll kind of wait for a moment for that person to get in and then say, oh, I'd really like to hear this person's comment. Some of it comes down to different norms. Some of it just comes down to somebody who just might be shy and isn't used to talking in the classroom. So I think kind of having the explicit norms and like allowing people to kind of create a culture of inclusion is super powerful. And as kind of the facilitator, being kind of willing to have silence while you're waiting for more people, more voices to come in is also kind of a strategy that we think about.
Great, thank you. Do we have another comment or question rather from the audience?
Hi, my name is Emma. Recently I read a piece of North American research that talked about colour blindness, and I thought it was quite interesting. It said that colour blindness propels reproduction of white privilege in ways that are largely covert and sometimes unintended through reproducing inequality via a business as usual mentality that denies the experiences of people from culturally and linguistically diverse groups and assumes there is an even playing field. How can we make people aware that not acknowledging diversity is perpetuating inequality?
Tim, I feel like this one's going to start with you.
Begins with putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I mean, if you mentioned that that piece of work came from, or that quote was taken from a North American piece of work. I mean, you think about how an African American parent talks to their son when the son hits puberty, and about how that boy should be living his life or going about his business in a public place. I mean, it's referred to as the talk that parents have, and that is because parents are concerned that if their children, in particular boys, don't respond the right way, if they're stopped by police, they may end up putting themselves in harm's way. Colour blindness is something you can, in all sincerity sometimes, adhere to if you have the luxury of not having your own colour noticed. But if you inhabit the world of certain groups, you just don't have the luxury of being colourblind, because people will notice your racial difference or your colour. So I think the exercise has got to be about taking a different perspective. The kinds of scenarios that I've tried to use in conversation with people is to draw on my own personal experience sometimes and say, when I was growing up here in Sydney in the 80s and 90s, my family would watch the news at 6 o'clock, when you used to watch the news at 6 o'clock, right? And I can tell you that if there was crime being reported in southwest Sydney, the whole family would kind of fall silent. There wouldn't need to be words exchanged between all of us. We'd all be there thinking the same thing, and we'll be thinking, hope it's not someone like us, because of course there was a big panic about Asian crime at the time. Now I can imagine that my classmates from a different background, if they heard of a news story about a bikie gang being arrested in Bankstown, I don't imagine my classmates from an Anglo-Celtic background sitting there with a chill in the air with their family thinking, I hope it's not one of us. And that's an example of how race plays out. That's an example of privilege, that for some people, a bad example is going to be potentially representative of you and your group or people like you. Whereas if you're in a different position, you may have the luxury of not having to live with any stigma attached to something, So the dynamic gets reproduced with different groups. I think of what happens in conversations we currently have, for example, with youth crime in Melbourne, and African Australian youth, and the stigma that they feel is perhaps very different to any kind of stigma that might attach itself to criminal behaviour being perpetrated by someone of a different cultural background. And quite often, you know, someone's cultural background isn't even made an issue, and it shouldn't be made an issue unless it has some bearing on it, but if you're from certain groups, then quite often it is.
Karen, do you have anything to add? I know you've got a strong research background in ostracism and similar topics.
Yeah, so I certainly, some of the things Tim said definitely resonated with me, and I think that you don't recognise privilege if you're in the privileged position, it goes under the radar. I guess I wasn't thinking so much about ostracism, but I thought it just came to mind a really fun study which looked at how certain people may be so hell-bent on a colourblind approach that if you get them in an experimental setting where they actually have to play Guess Who, and the obvious thing is to describe these people in terms of their race, their race, they just won't do it. And I think that just speaks to how ludicrous some of that assumption is, that we really can't see it. And sometimes it's relevant, and sometimes it ought to be acknowledged. And hopefully that those sorts of examples might get people to realise that actually, we need to have these sorts of conversations.
Great, thank you. Was there another question?
Hi, Sam Haynes from the Behavioural Insights team. I think most of the people in this room would like to think of themselves as enlightened on a lot of the diversity issues, and perhaps someone who tries to be unbiased in any way they can. I mean, I've taken an implicit association test, as I'm sure many of you have. The results were not what I wanted. It showed that I was biased against minority groups. So, to use an example perhaps from your research, Michael, showing that people offer lower prices for Airbnb hosts who are from ethnic minority groups. If we here want to be virtuous, we want to be the unbiased people, what do we do in our personal lives in particular to embody that? Should we offer those hosts more money just out of the blue? Perhaps.
This is a great opportunity for us to hear a little bit more about your research and extend the conversation beyond sort of organisational context, so please.
Sure, yeah, so kind of the background on some of the Airbnb research we have been looking at the platform, and it used to be that people thought that kind of the rise of online platforms is going to purge bias, right? But now kind of if you think about the types of platforms we're seeing now, Airbnb and Uber that have these kind of detailed profiles and pictures of people, what we've seen is that kind of discrimination has come up even in markets like hotels that kind of had purged bias through kind of regulation and enforcement. So we had seen in the U.S. context kind of widespread discrimination against African Americans. There's kind of nothing unique about the U.S. context. People kind of replicated this around the world, looking at kind of race, sexual orientation, disabilities, and found discrimination of all sorts on the platform. And we thought a lot afterwards about kind of who are the different people that might be involved. So regulators clearly kind of would be one. So we kind of push hard for Airbnb to be more transparent, for regulators to try to push for more transparency, to kind of get baseline reporting. Platforms and kind of organizations to think about how can they be better choice architects at kind of implementing things to reduce bias. So kind of Airbnb, as a response, kind of increase the number of transactions that are just automated, right? And then users. So what can you do as a person who feels like you're kind of in an environment and you want to be as bias-free as possible? And some of the things we thought about. So we created an extension on Airbnb. So if you're a host or you're a guest and you don't want to look at people's pictures, you could kind of download this and put this kind of as a browser extension, and it'll blind the whole process for you. So I think kind of there are technical solutions, but you could also think about, like, do I want to be using instant booking and not trying to kind of go through a process where I'm basically handcuff yourself, like be your own choice architect to remove the potential for a bias. Or use Applied if you're kind of trying to think about the hiring process, and think kind of what are the things that I could do to kind of think through all the things, all the areas where bias may creep in, and what are the solutions you could do to start to remove the opportunity for bias to occur.
Great, thank you. Of course.
Those are ways that I can change the system, account for bias. Is there a way to make myself less
So when you say change the system, those are technical systems. But for example, I kind of think about Max Bazerman, Iris Bonet, and Alexandra Van Geen have a paper where they kind of look at the way that you evaluate employees. And if you're kind of evaluating 2 people at a time, you're going to be less, your stereotypes based on race and gender are going to play less of a role than if you're looking at one candidate at a time, where you kind of say, oh, this person seems good. Maybe it's kind of because you have the last person in mind. So I would think that it still comes down to understanding kind of where the bias occurs, how you're making the decision, and how can you change, either kind of technically change the process or just change the way that you're going about it.
I mean, I would have thought slowing things down was just an obvious way to do this, right? Because it's when you resort to shortcuts, and it's in periods of stress or high levels of activity when you're going to default to making a snap judgment. So I would have thought slowing, I don't know, I'm not the expert here obviously on behavioural insights, but I would have thought slowing things down and being more deliberative would lend itself to you making a better decision, and more free of bias. I don't know.
Great. We might move on to a slightly different topic now. Tim, you talked a lot about the need for more data in the cultural diversity space. And we all know that data is king or queen or emperor in the BI space. Kate, you collect a lot of data through Applied. Where do you think the biggest data gaps are in this space, and where should we be encouraging our organisations and our HR teams to collect more data to help inform the sort of nudges people would like to see in this space?
So I was really, some of you might know that in the UK we've just implemented the gender pay gap regulation, so it's come into place in April of this year. It's actually quite an interesting regulatory approach to this problem, which is they basically said any company with 250 employees or more must now publicly report what its gender pay gaps are in 3 different dimensions. Interestingly, behaviourally informed not only on sort of salary and kind of full-time employment, but also on bonuses, because as most of the research suggests, that the more transparency you have, generally speaking, the greater fairness you have. And lo and behold, they found that like the median pay gap between men and women across the economy is about 18%. The median bonus pay gap is more like 50%. So anyway, they were quite behavioural in the kind of metrics they were looking at, but now companies now need to publicly report this. And in the lead up to it, there was a load of discussion in the UK about, okay, HR teams running around like headless chicken thinking, oh my God, we need to collect this data and it's going to be terrifying what we find out. And lo and behold, it was. But what I was really surprised at is really large organisations, you'd say to them, how's that going? And they'd say, oh, we're doing the gender stuff now. And then some of them would honestly tell you they've got a person coding manually using names of employees and making assumptions about gender. And you think that's gender. And to your point, Tim, like, they're so far behind doing that on any other dimensions of diversity. But I think what's intriguing is that one conversation has launched a bunch of HR teams into thinking we cannot be going through this again. 1, we need to be collecting better. And 2, while we're at it, why don't we go beyond gender? And they can see on the horizon as the kind of gender diversity on boards has now in the UK moved to ethnic diversity on boards. They're seeing that kind of shift is coming, so they're trying to get ahead of it. So, I mean, I'm fully in support of, I don't think we're ever going to know what works unless we at least have better baseline data. Through our platform, we hope to do that through the kind of the candidate experience. One of the things we're currently challenged by is how do we benchmark? So we would love to be working with the organisations that we help to hire to better understand what's moving the needle, which of the various things that we're trialling through the platform are actually changing. And they don't even know what good looks like right now. And you can come up with, there's a lot of work being done in the United States around, a lack of diversity in the tech sector, but that's still only one set of, one part of the economy and doesn't help people in other parts of the economy really know what works. So, I mean, I guess it comes down to platforms. It's easier to collect data than it ever was. It's cheaper to collect it than it ever was. To Cass's points, we should always give people the opportunity to not divulge information that they don't feel comfortable divulging. We should always tell them how that information is being used. In our case, they're never identified as a person on any of that data. It's always aggregate and anonymised. But one of the things I did find recently when we were going back through all of our data, we allow people to opt out of giving, like you could give, your gender, ethnicity, disability, and sexual orientation, but you might opt out on giving socioeconomic status. That's an option that you have. What's intriguing to me is how people have very differential rates of comfort giving diversity data. So we found that the people seem most comfortable with divulging gender and probably least comfortable with socioeconomic status, and there's a huge variety in between there. And I think that differs context to context. So I think getting a better understanding of what people feel comfortable with, what categories they feel genuinely are useful categories for them to answer, or whether they opt out and say, that doesn't work for me, is super helpful. So that's what I have to offer.
Thank you. Now, I'm really conscious that I'm standing between you and lunch. So we might give the audience one more question, and then we'll start to wrap up the discussion. You're going to have to get really aggressive if you've got the best question in the room. Thank you.
Good morning. Kane Beckett from Prime Minister and Cabinet. If behavioural economics is about understanding what levers we can pull and nudge people a little bit better, and I think I'm being reasonably uncontroversial in saying most of the levers we've tried to pull for the last 40 years haven't worked very well. What behavioural insights do you think we might be able to draw from it about understanding what different levers we might pull, or in different ways that we haven't, I guess, consciously gone after as much before? I'm thinking of some of the things that are not mentioned, in part coming back to the first question that we heard. I think what's not talked about, for example, is at least 2 of the 4 leaders that you talked about in your slide, Tim, of the 4 organisations. At least 2 of them have done that because there's a profit motive there, not because they're trying to be particularly socially nice. Do you have any insights around what levers or what nudges we might like to think about that might work better perhaps than some of the ones we've tried until now?
Great, thank you. Kate,
Sure.
What's next for Applied, or where's the ripest area for us to jump into an experiment?
So, I mean, from the organisational standpoint, we focus on hiring decisions, but a lot of people in this room and elsewhere would say that there's as much sort of bias and stuff to be worried about in performance management. And Tim's point is absolutely real. Like, the reason why there's no succession for greater ethnic diversity is that we're not promoting people at the same rates. So I think moving into ways of using behavioural science to better understand how we understand potential, which is equally thorny, and a lot of people would say actually we've over-focused on what potential looks like in organisations as compared with we know you can do the job and we believe you've got the skills to take this organisation forward. So from my perspective, I think there's a huge sort of in the talent pipeline question, a lot more that we could be doing.
Great, thank you. Mike, I'm sure you've got some thoughts.
So a couple of thoughts on this. One, I guess, would be something we didn't touch on here is algorithms and kind of the role that data could play in this. So we sort of tend to think about, algorithms give rise to potential for discrimination, but actually they also give rise for the possibility of kind of pulling out bias from a bunch of situations where bias is occurring. So I think kind of there's probably a lot of work where kind of at a bare minimum, you're kind of controlling the extent of bias in the situation over time. I guess I would also take a little bit of, I would push back a little bit on the argument that kind of nothing has changed. Like, I think if you look at the sectors where there have been a combination of a push for transparency, kind of coupled with like good incentives for companies to think about how to have a more diverse workforce, like kind of tech sector being one of them, where you see bunches of companies kind of go in a 3-4 year span from 10% female in their engineering workforce to 20%. Kind of, it's clear that there's still a long way to go, and I think that's where kind of the role of what else can we do, but I think kind of there's also been some success story. I kind of go back to what Tim was saying earlier about having kind of more tracking and metrics. So we talk about transparency and baseline metrics, but one thing where I think there's been a real shortage of kind of, if you look kind of just around the world, I think that there are kind of nuggets of areas where people are doing research on it, but it shouldn't just kind of be left to, Karen and Applied and researchers kind of to figure out what are the best practices. I think kind of companies could get more skin in the game and be transparent not only about what the baseline is, but what they've tried, and do more randomized control trials to figure out what's worked in their context, to start to figure out what's going to generalize to other settings. Kind of as a concrete example, we talk about Starbucks. Starbucks has a lot of stores. They shut down for a day. They didn't do an RCT to kind of figure out did this have any impact or not. So we have kind of no idea other than to sort of say, they were doing this, maybe they were doing it because they thought it would look good to do it, or maybe they thought it was actually going to move the needle, and who knows.
Great, thank you. Look, we're nearly out of time, so I'd like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to share with you a key thought, a piece of advice, where they think is the highest value space that we should be focusing our efforts in, or to share any last parting messages that you haven't had the chance to speak about. Tim, would you like to go first? I know you've had them.
Sure, and I suppose it's partly in response to Kane's question. We focused a lot in our advocacy on the issue of power and the unwritten rules that exist around power and leadership. This is me going back to my undergraduate economics now, but you know, you can understand this as being about the asymmetry of information that exists between different groups in society. So, some people might have an inside track and a more intimate and organic sense of how things work and a knowledge of which key is going to unlock certain doors. Other groups will not. And if there's going to be some further work done around diversity issues, I'd be very interested in work that would delve into the dynamics that exist around sponsorship or mentorship, and looking at the mechanisms through which some of these unwritten or unspoken rules are transmitted. So that would be, I think, very germane territory, because I suspect, you know, I'm aware of some of the private research that Australian organisations have done, for example, on this, where they've tracked the networks that emerge from senior leadership positions in executive and also board roles, and there's a very high level of correlation between where you went to school and the people you know, you know, this is not published research, but I know that ASX 10 companies did this more than a decade ago, and they found that with male leaders in Australian leadership positions, who you went to school with at primary school had an outsized effect. For women, who you went to school with at a secondary level had an outsized effect. You know, you make of that what you will, but I think there's something in that that's worth looking into.
Thank you. Kate?
So I think we talk a lot about the diversity dividend, and as Tim mentioned, there's been a lot of correlational work to show that, you know, teams that are more diverse tend to produce better outcomes. I think the next phase for all of us interested in this stuff is getting better at the causal impact. So there's some interesting lab-based studies that try and pull teams together that are both homogenous and heterogeneous and put them through different types of tasks as a way of sort of prosecuting that same thing. We need more of that done in actual organisations, done with some level of scientific rigour, so we can understand when, where and how we are actually getting these kinds of, you know, business case dividends, because let's face it, there are some people who will only be convinced by those business case those dividends, and times where it doesn't work and what we can learn from that. So including how do we get comfortable with the uncomfortable, and how do teams deal with in the inevitability that sometimes when there's more diversity, things can seem trickier. But that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's harnessed in the right kind of way. So I think, you know, I would echo Mike's comments that, you know, organisations interested in this teaming up with researchers keen to do a slightly more robust analysis of what works will be in everyone's best interest.
Thank you. Karen?
I guess one of the things I think that organisations need to look at is inclusion. So there's been a lot of focus on diversity, but inclusion is obviously paramount to making sure that people feel a sense of belonging. And some of that can be achieved by bringing in role models at different levels of the organisation. It could also be achieved by just looking at some of the signals that you might have in your organisations, which might signal that certain people are perhaps not as welcome. You know, what are the signs on your toilet doors saying? Do you have accessibility? Are you catering to people who may be neurodiverse? And all of those sorts of things are worth examining just to make sure that your environment is a friendly one that appreciates differences and wants to hang on to people who are diverse.
Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, so to kind of echo some of the things that have already come up, I think first it's understanding the value proposition of diversity. So I do think there's a lot of value in organizations thinking about what are the benefits and how do we try to capture them. Two, kind of collaboratively working as a set of organizations toward building frameworks for understanding what works. I think we have lots of nuggets that we think work in some situations, but understanding what's going to work and when is kind of a very important thing that I think we could all do. So then I would kind of close with thinking about like where some of this bias comes from. So I think kind of whether it's discrimination, whether you kind of call it racism, whatever kind of term you're going to use. I think kind of in our personal lives, in our professional lives, trying to understand where this comes from. There's a lot of research now on stereotyping and understanding that kind of people go into these situations, think that they're kind of making an inference. Maybe the inference is, oh, I think this person's in finance, or maybe it's something else. And what the research has shown is that people are using their beliefs to make assessments, but their beliefs are all over the map. So I think kind of when organizations are sitting there saying things like, well, we don't have time for this yet, part of what their mental model is, well, we want to get the best people. And I think kind of having the humility to understand that just because you think that you're drawing good inferences doesn't mean that you're making the correct inference in a given situation.
Great. Thank you everyone for your time and attention today and all of your great questions. I had tons and I feel like I didn't get to ask a lot of them, so I'm sure that sentiment is shared in the room. This is such a great topic, there's so much happening, and I think there's a lot we can learn. So thank you to our wonderful panellists. Tim, thank you for your time. I know you're a busy man and the clock is ticking. We've loved having you here today. Kate and Mike, you're here for the remainder of the conference and presenting, involved in a couple of other sessions, so you'll get to hear from their wisdom in different areas over the next day or two. And thank you, Karen. We've really loved having all of your views. Karen will be here as a participant, and I'm sure would be happy to share her views if you want to grab her at one of the breaks and find out a little bit more. Thanks, everyone.